Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to see so many of you out this evening. Thank you all very much for coming out on such a wet night and predicting a little bit of a storm coming later, but we'll be safe home before that happens. So tonight, as part of Heritage Week, we here in St Mary's Collegiate Church here in Youghal are delighted to welcome Michael O'Neill. Michael has been an architectural historian and a digital archivist for many years, but much more important than that, of course, he's a native of Youghal, and he grew up in McCartanstown, is that right? That's right. And so it's great to welcome you back here, Michael, and to hear what you have to say about this extraordinary and amazing building and its history and something of its importance, not just here in Youghal, but in the wider architectural scene in Ireland. And to hope you point out to some of you some of the amazing features if you haven't been here before, some of the things that are well worth a look, and we get a chance maybe to have a little look afterwards. Just to say, tonight's talk is being recorded and it'll be available on our YouTube channel later on in a couple of days' time when we've had a chance to process it. Michael.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll just mic myself up here. Now, is that better? Can you hear at all? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, oh perfect, okay. Thank you very much, Andrew. That's wonderful. Delighted to be here and to be back in Youghal. I was saying to Lydia there a while ago that when I was looking at this church first, it was Bobby Chapel used to let you in and out, and I'm wondering, I'm sure you all remember Bobby Chapel. So what I want to talk about is this wonderful church here, and in the context of, I suppose, Irish medieval architecture beyond Youghal. I want to start here with this introductory slide. That website, can you see if I stand here? You can. That website, archdrawings.ireland.org, is a collection of something like 9,000 drawings in the RCB, represented at the Church Body Library in Dublin, of architectural drawings of Church of Ireland churches. It's available to use, it's freely available. And I did that project, finished it about maybe 8 or 7 years ago. And following on in that, then I decided I should write a book, or I persuaded other people that I should write a book, or that they would publish it. So, based on using those drawings and what I had looked at over the years, in last spring, this book, An Architectural History of the Church of Ireland, I wrote that. And I was delighted in the introductory chapter to use St Mary's in Youghal as sort of as a way into the subject, insofar as it's a medieval church that is continued in use the whole way through to the 21st century. Vicissitudes of all sorts along the way, and as importantly really as a historian trying to understand the ins and outs of the Church of Ireland in terms of its architecture, was of course one of the fact that one of the great historians of Youghal, Canon Samuel Heyman, who was a curate here, lived in Youghal. Heyman's lived here for since the 1660s. He was the historian, and when I was growing up, I was there struggling, I suppose, in a sense with Heyman, because a huge fund of knowledge, but it's only later you realise that there are, cracks is the wrong word, but he had points of view that fitted in with his time, and you look back on it now and say, okay, well, that's got to do with ecclesiology, which wouldn't make sense maybe when you were looking at it, or maybe using his guidebooks just to walk around the churches. He had, as we would say now, an agenda, but we all have agendas, nothing we can do about that. So that's sort of the background before I start. If I move on to the next slide. No, am I doing the right one? No, not this one. Okay, so St Mary's Youghal. We're sitting in it. It's wonderful when you give a lecture and you're actually in the building. It makes it so much easier in ways. So what we have here is a large, very large cruciform church, which basically is a church in the shape of a cross. It's got an aisle nave, quite unusual in a sense. It's got transepts, large transepts, and it's got a very large choir. Now there is a development over the centuries in terms of the extension of the choir and things like that. But here's a view from the southwest. You're all familiar with this. And what we're seeing basically is, it's not in focus, folks, is it?
Yeah.
It is, okay. We have here the chancel, and it's the head behind me there, the south transept. These windows here are 19th century, we'll come back to that later on. And it's got a candle snuffer roof, which is quite unusual. Instead of having lean-to roofs for the aisles, it's a continuous sloping roof. And popping up over there behind, on the other side, is a residential tower from the 14th century for the priest who was here, and possibly for the vicar as well. So that's the context there. If I move on, this is I suppose to the uncurious who are walking around Youghal, this is what they will see if they walk up the street. They will see this front of the church, and it is of course wonderful that it's now open all the time. It's extraordinary. I spend a lot of my life going around trying to get into churches, and it can be quite difficult, Church of Ireland churches, trying to find a key holder and stuff like that. The fact that this is open and available every day is just extraordinary. We have here a very, very fine east window, flamboyant architectural style, good crocketing on the gable, and there was pinnacles here. They're a little bit worn down. And here again we have the residential tower, and that little feature there is a bell cut. So it wasn't originally a bell tower, it was a residential tower with a little bell up in the corner there. Here, when we now move to the west front, we get the first indication, I suppose, that this is a complex building. This is showing its age in a sense. It's been pulled around, I suppose, for 800 years. And the west gable here, we have again what I mentioned about the cat-slide roof, or for want of a better word, or candle snuffer roof. These windows are 19th century. There were doors into the aisles up to the certainly the 1820s. The three-light west window, I think there's been some work done to the top of the windows, or to the hood molds. The other feature that is there's a scar here. Both Heyman and Fitzgerald, whom I think did a lot of the drawings for Youghal, they reckon that there was some sort of a conical tower there at some stage, some sort of a bell tower. I don't think there is room there for it to be a round tower, which somebody suggested recently. I don't think so. But anyway, I'm not going to argue with that. The doorway is very fine. It's of two orders: outer order with the colonnettes there, and an inner order rising straight from the base. Here it's rising from, straight from the ground. Here it's rising from a base. It's got what are called folia capital here. It's unusually it's built in. It was done in sandstone, so it's just wearing. It's friable. It's wearing away. Having said it, it's wearing away. It's looked like this for the last 40 years, so that's why it's lasted. Basically, from the mid 13th century. It's a very fine door case. Moving on to the interior, and this is why it's wonderful, that we're actually in the building. So what we have, essentially, are a number of features, and let me just, I can point them out in the church as well, perhaps as to the slide. First of all, behind you, we have this tree-light window in the west gable. Below it, there is a gallery which dates from 1810. What's really important looking eastwards is the fact that it is an aisled nave. These aren't, an awful lot of parish churches just didn't have aisles. And it's they're very finely wrought stone around the edges of the arches, cut stone, and then in between it's rubble stone. The other features are, of course, the tile floor, which is 19th century. The pews you're sitting in are also 19th century. They're very generous size. If you're used to other churches there, you don't have as much leg room. So they're almost like box pews. They're that sort of a shape, and they were redoing these in the really 1870s after this establishment. It was very generous use of space. The other major features in the interior is this thing behind me there, pointed over here, which is obviously a seat for somebody important. It's got a what a bishop wears, a mitre on top, indicating that it's a bishop's seat. And what happens is, and we'll come to this in a minute, the warden of the church in Youghal was also the Bishop of Cloyne. So that's why it's got that bishop's, what's the word?
Mitre.
Mitre, thank you very much, on top. This is the pulpit, I'm showing it here. Pulpit here is was paid for by Pierce Dew, the incumbent at the Restoration in the 1860s. It's got a tester over it, which is for amplifying sound. So it's a very decent piece of architecture. I will show you later that there was an earlier version. So he paid for that. So that's what's happening there. What else do I have to say about this? If you want to try and imagine the medieval appearance of the nave, what you do is, okay, subtract the tile floor and think that they may either have been limestone slabs or hardened earth, much less seating, sometimes seating just against the walls. The weak go to the walls. If you were too tired from standing in church, you went and you sat on benches against the walls. I think the other main feature would have been that the walls would have been rendered. Okay, you wouldn't have the bare masonry exposed as it is now. And in fact, what you might have had is it may have been etched to look like it was a very decent ashlar stone. That would be the other major feature. And the other main thing, of course, is that that the open roof here, which is just one of the magnificent bits of Youghal, features of Youghal Church, I'll talk about it again in a second, it wouldn't have been exposed like that. It would have been panelled and perhaps painted. So it would have looked very different. Essentially, what's really interesting, of course, about the fact is that we have transepts, unusual enough, and of course this east bay it's not so much a crossing bay, but it allows access to both transepts. So it's a very important church. When you read the text or you read the guidebooks, they always say it's either St. Nicholas in Galway or St. Mary's in Youghal is the biggest parish church in Ireland. So you can choose which one you want it to be. Having said that, it is still within the ambit of parish churches. If it was a cathedral, it would have lighting, clear sea lighting in the nave. It probably would have had a crossing tower and vaulting. So it's not. It doesn't try to get beyond itself. It is parish church architecture, albeit a very good example of it. So if I go on to the next slide, again, we're in the building so we can see what's going on here. I'm just looking in here, which is into the north transept. The north transept has, north transept has an aisle, which is unusual feature to have an aisle to a transept in a parish church. And the south transept, as you know, has been taken over as a Boyle chapel since a mausoleum since the 1610s or thereabouts, a little earlier, 1603, 1604. What am I going to say about that? What's really interesting, and you can look at it yourselves in a second, is the woodwork on the door into the south transept. I suspect that's medieval. If it's not medieval, it is early Jacobean, so it's early 17th century. But I suspect it's medieval. I suspect it's part of the original rood screen in this building. Now, behind me is we've got the choir, and we've got the chancel arch. And the chancel arch is a very fine feature. It's got two orders, a bit like the West Front, very good voussoirs, molded capitals, colonnettes down to the bases. Here we are, here, And here we are here. So a very fine feature. Again, I would suggest probably mid-13th century in date. When I was looking at this building as a youngster in my late teens, this thing here used to puzzle me completely. People said, oh, that's to do with that's a rood screen, but I didn't know what a rood screen was. So what you have to imagine, or even a pulpitum, what you have to imagine in a medieval church is that you didn't have a view, we don't have a screen here, but you didn't have a view straight into the choir in a medieval church. There was always a screen in the way, and the clergyman or the priest was in the east end, and the congregation was in the west end, and there were two different spaces with a screen in between. So what I suspect is the case is that this is in two different periods. I think in the earlier period there would have been a screen, something like this, dividing the crossing from the chancel. And I think in the late medieval period, in the 1460s, 1470s, when, and I'll come to this again in a second, when the Fitzgerald Earls of Desmond became involved with this church, I think this far more elaborate pulpitum was put in, or screen here, with the gallery over it. So if you can imagine there, a gallery across to there. Does that make sense? And what would have happened is you still had the screen from the nave through to the chancel, but the Earls of Desmond would have sat up on top. This is how the world worked in the medieval period. You brought your status with you into church. You didn't come in everybody as a humble supplicant. The lords and ladies would have sat up there watching the mass taking place, and us, the punters in the nave, would have been watching what was going on. So I think that possibly explains what's going on there. And there's also a stair going further up, and I'll show you later that there actually was a gallery even further up there. So a very elaborate rood screen, or perhaps a pulpitum with seating on it, or perhaps the other possibility is that there was a medieval organ up there, which you often sometimes found, for example, in Clare Island off the west coast. There's an Augustinian priory there that has drawings of organs. So there you are. This is a horrible photograph, and I'll go past. Well, this one over here, on the next one over here, very badly taken. It's the north transept windows. All I want to show you is that it's got very fine colonnettes here again, which are with banded shafts. Again, would sort of suggest a mid-century date. When we look at the exterior, go back out to the exterior again. The south transept has been fairly pulled around a bit, so you can't rely too much on the features as they survive. Insofar as it became the Boyle Mausoleum, and it was further repaired in the 19th century. But I think the windows of the north transept are pretty okay. Both the gable, the aisle, and the windows on the east side, and they're quite delicate. They're double and triple lancets, and quite delicate things. And here again, we have the surviving buttress. So I think it's all pointing towards sort of probably mid-century would make sense. And Harald Leask, who was the famous medieval architectural historians from the 1960s, sort of suggested that date for most of the building. When we come to looking at one of the most extraordinary features of this church, and just look up there yourselves. You don't need to look at the screen. Look up at that roof. It's quite extraordinary. It's a medieval oak roof. They're as rare as hen's teeth. There's maybe 3 or 4 in Ireland. It's an extraordinary thing to have. You've got the same roof structure there, and some of it survives also in the north transept. And it's called a scissor brace roof. So what you have is, when you build a roof on a building this size, it wants to do several things. First of all, it wants to just collapse out, push out the walls. So you end up putting in the collar beam there across to stop it sliding off. You also need to stop it. They're inclined to rack. In other words, each frame is inclined to either fall that direction or this direction. So you have to put a very strong structure here, like this one here, to hold it in place. And then, of course, you have what's called the scissor braces, which stop wind shear. In other words, wind pushing the roof that way or that way. So you have all these functions all working together to keep the roof in place. And what's extraordinary about medieval roofs is that they were actually constructed on the ground in total, and then taken apart again, and then put together back up onto space. So there were no surprises. You worked out all the problems on the ground. There's no point being way up there on the scaffolding and discovering that a whole beam's got to come down and be cut away. There is a lady called Maura Guiney, who I think she was in UCC. Dr. Guiney did work on roofs in medieval churches, and she's dating this quite late. So I'm not sure how we're going to. What do you make of that? I presume it's the original roof. I mean, I can't see why it wouldn't be, but maybe somebody will enlighten me about that. So, so I'm trying to build up a picture in your heads that this is some very, very fine features. I said that it's a cruciform church with nave aisles, and you find them in quite a number of other places. For example, here is, this is St. Nicholas in Galway. This is our rival. This is the one everybody says is the biggest medieval church in Ireland, and we say no, Youghal is. So it's a very different aesthetic, you can see. It's 14th century. Instead of here, which has got a lot of rubble masonry, here there's an awful lot of carboniferous limestone used on the piers, and it shows the influence really of Friary architecture in the West. I suppose it trumps Youghal in one way. It's actually got a crossing tower, and it's got rib vaulting at the crossing, so it does have that. But again, it's a century later. Another medieval church, again in an urban setting, is St. Nicholas in Carrickfergus. It had an aisle nave. Now the outside or the aisles are long gone. And more generally, if you look closer, sort of east from here, I suppose, a lady called Anna Dolan, an architect working for the OPW, did a study some 20 years ago now, looking at churches in Ossory, in other words, County Kilkenny, and in Loughlin, which is County Laois for the most part. And the ones I want to look at over here is a plan of Youghal. You can see here the aisle nave, the transepts, and the chancel. And here are some examples. So, for example, here we have Callum, which has an aisle nave. So does Thomastown. So does, which one is that? Goran. And the final one, we don't have to worry about there, because it's not a parish church. Here we have St. Mary's in Kilkenny, which is now the Kilkenny Mile Museum, which somebody may be familiar with. And this one is St. Mary's New Ross. So these two here have an aisle nave as well as having transepts. And as you can see, they're getting New Ross is getting quite close. It's getting quite close to the size of Youghal. So having large cruciform churches in an urban setting is not that unusual. What is unusual about Youghal is the fact that it survived and we have this medieval interior, because if you look at these exact same churches, in the 19th century, with the Board of First Fruits, these were radically changed. So, for example, in the case of Callum, isn't it? I'm trying to remember which one it is. Bear with me. Anyway, Thomastown, there is a church in the nave, so a First Fruits church built in the medieval nave. The rest of the church is gone. In Goran, the chancel is used as the parish church. The nave is bare and ruined. And in St. Mary's in Kilkenny, it's been shorn of its aisles. It's not in use as a church anymore, it's now a museum. And you can see in New Ross, which is a really big church, there is a large First Fruits church in the body of the nave, extending into the chancel. When I say First Fruits church, what I mean, what we mostly mean by that is one of these churches with a a towering steeple at the west end. You know, you see them. Killa is a good example close by, also Ardmore, for example. But this is the fate that could have befell someplace like Youghal. It didn't. It didn't become. It didn't get a 19th century church put into the body of the medieval church. It survived intact to that extent. And finally, what I want to, in this section, I mentioned this already, this residential tower for the priest and possibly the vicar in the medieval church here in St. Mary's in Youghal. And then, so that's sort of the medieval, or the early medieval period. The big change, of course, came in 1468 when the Earls of Desmond, the Fitzgerald Earls of Desmond, decided to create a collegiate church in Youghal. They did one in Kilmallock and in Youghal. And it basically completely changed much of the structure of the church, insofar as we end up with this very fine chancel, and it's here behind me, and you can look into it. It's got a number of interesting features. I talked about this east window at the very beginning. It's a flamboyant style window. It doesn't have cusping, and I'll show you what cusping means in a minute. But then a lot of churches in this area, in the area controlled by the Desmonds, didn't have the latest what's called perpendicular style architecture. The other feature that's unusual about it, to a certain extent, is that when the chancel was extended, they continued to use what would have been considered then slightly old-fashioned architecture. You would have expected slightly different window types here, but they're the same almost as the windows that were used in the 13th century in the transepts and at the west end. We have crocketing here, which is a good late medieval feature, and very fine buttresses. So it's a very good building, and here we have a buttress that also serves as a doorway, and this doorway led from the college, which I'll talk about in a second, through that way for the clergy. So what the Desmonds set up was a collegiate church for a warden, eight clergy and 8 singing fellows. So that's a huge commitment in terms of changing a parish church into a collegiate structure. And these were secular clergy. They weren't monastic in any way or form. They were free to move around. They weren't tied to a cloister in any shape, in any way like that. And in fact, we know that as time went on, they had functions serving other parishes in the area for which they were responsible. They had responsibility. But it would have been a huge fillip or a huge boost to a town wall like Youghal to suddenly have a collegiate structure like this with well-educated clergy and singing men, and it would have upped both the form of worship in the church and also in surrounding parishes. So it was a very huge, a very big endowment. Just here very quickly, this window is a late medieval form. There's only one of them. The others, they revert to the earlier form, but it's got late medieval features. So now when, and here very quickly is Callan, which has what I call perpendicular tracery. That wasn't used in Youghal, just to show you the difference there. Now, and this is the Fleming tomb within here, which does have late medieval features. So what I want to talk about is, of course, the chancel, the interior of the chancel, as we see it here. I think originally it would have been, if you can imagine a square of the width of the chancel, and if you extend that way, that would have been the original width of the chancel. And I think that it's been extended by what's called a root 2 rectangle that's been a 1.41 sides to a 1 base extension further east. Very fine interior. The rear arches of the south side are late medieval. They are also late medieval on the north side, but they're simpler. The east window we discussed. The other feature again, which shows the sort of the Desmonds' reticence, or perhaps it's some sort of political statement whereby what we have here at the east end is what's called a sedilia and piscina arrangement. So sedilia is seating, so it's 3 seats for the main celebrant, for the deacon, and for the acolyte, who would have sat there during, it would have been high mass at that stage. And here at beyond that is a thing called a piscina, which is it's a structure that has a drain out to the ground, because when you consecrate a mass or a church now, you're not supposed to pour the water into a drain. It's got to go straight into the ground, and this is what piscina were. But what's unusual here is that even though you would expect a late medieval form with a square head, it's got it looks more like a 13th century feature, but it's got late medieval details in it. So it's a very conscious evocation of an earlier period. I mentioned that there was a warden and 8 fellows, or eight clergy and eight singing fellows. The warden lived here, Myrtle Grove. So I was trying to think on the way down, how would I explain this to you? If any of you have, what's that Hilary Mantel series, Wolf Hall? If you think of Wolf Hall, think of the number of people who were dealing with Thomas Cromwell. I mean, he would have had a huge retinue. So this would have been basically, this is a very, very fancy glebe house, or almost as big as a bishop's palace. And this is where the warden lived. That's a early 20th century photograph. That's one I took 7 or 8 years ago in the winter, when you could actually see into it from the wall, from inside here. And on the other side, we have the college for the 8 priests and the 8 singing fellows. This is a slightly later. This is a 1681 drawing by a man called Thomas Delaney, where he records the form of the college. It's now owned by the it's owned by the council, isn't it? But it was for a while. It was a convent, wasn't it? And I think it was changed in the mid 18th century to be, and eventually became a convent. What we have here is, I think this is probably the medieval range, and here in front are buildings added on by Richard Boyle. Richard Boyle took over the college in the early 17th century. This is one of these very romantic pictures of showing the ruined choir. I'll come on to that in a second. I'm looking at the warden's house. So it's a huge complex suddenly in this corner of the town. A really, really important. How was it funded? Basically, what the Earls of Desmond would be able to do is they would have what are called advalescents, which basically means that they had the right to appoint clergy in parishes. And clergy in parishes were funded by what are called tithes, so it was 1/10 of the income. So 1/10 of your income, if you lived in a parish, was to go to the church. Okay, in the medieval period. Now sometimes it was less, and there was also a thing called vicarial tithes, which were smaller tithes that went to the curate or the vicar. But what would have happened is the Earls of Desmond, who were powerful all over Munster, obviously had the advalescents of these parishes. So here is Youghal itself. Okay, here's Clonpriest, here is Ardagh, here is Eachlamurra, and here is Killa. So these are the parishes just all east of Youghal, which were in the control of the Desmonds, which they were able to give to the College of Youghal as an income. And they also had some vicarial tithes, which are smaller tithes in other parishes, like in Garryvoe. And also, obviously, at the west end of Cork, in West Cork, the Desmonds obviously also have control of these parishes. That's Skull Parish there. That's down to Mizenhead, isn't it? Whatever that Scotland parish is. And slightly over here, you have near Union Hall. So the income from all these parishes, the tithes, came into this new Collegiate Church of St. Mary's. So it was quite wealthy. And we know, for example, that the 8th Earl of Desmond was buried in the chancel, so it was considered important to them. So you can see how, what a change this would have made to a town like Youghal, a walled town like Youghal, which also, of course, had friaries at both ends, had Dominicans north and Franciscans at the south end. A lot of clergy knocking about in one way or another. Oops, what have I done here? Seem to have frozen here. It is decided to freeze. That's it, perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks, Andrew. So, moving into the early modern period, we have, of course, the Reformation period. I don't need to talk about that particularly here. But what you have going along with that is you have what I suppose is often called the Tudor expansion or the Tudor reconquest of Ireland. You know, they had tried in the 12th century, it sort of had worked a bit in the east, with the east of the country with the Pale, and then of course with the Tudors, with certainly Henry VIII and Edward VI, and then into Elizabeth, they started to move south and west, and people like the Desmonds were suddenly being surrounded by what were beginning to be called the New English. And eventually the Fitzgeralds of Desmond rebelled twice. In the second Desmond Rebellion of 1579, they sacked Youghal. Youghal would have been seen as obviously a port town that would have had influences from, say, Bristol and places like that, and they would have seen that possibly as sort of an avenue in for what were soon called the New English. Richard Boyle was a Bishop of Cloyne, 1620, I think. He was preceded the 2 years before that by John Boyle, who was a brother of Richard Boyle, the Earl of Cork. What I should say then, in terms of this, is just very briefly, is that after the Second Desmond Rebellion, they lost their lands. They were given to Sir Walter Raleigh, who eventually sold them through, I think, a man called Jones, to Richard Boyle, later the Earl of Cork. And, you know, he took over the college, essentially, because the Desmonds had the advancements. He by buying over whatever was 22,000 acres in Munster, he had the advancements, suddenly had the advancements of the college. He used the college as his own place to live, and basically as, to a certain extent, as a way to I have a better way of saying it here. So the Earl went on to make the college the focus of his estates, building an elaborate family monument in the church, which is in the south transept, which we can look at later, and enjoying the ecclesiastical rights and income of the wardens and chaplains as patron, and taking over the college residence as his family dwelling. So in a sense, this collegiate church, built by the Desmonds, was in one sense the beginning of Boyle's rise to great prominence in Ireland in the early 17th century. So there is the notion, and I haven't seen the documentation for that, as part of the sack of Youghal in 1579, that the Desmonds desecrated the chancel, at least of this church. Now, they may or may not. We know from the 1615, 22 and 1633 visitations of the diocese that they say both the nave and chancel were in repair. So you sort of have to wonder whether they were, and certainly Boyle said that he kept the chancel in repair. And also I think his first son was buried in the chancel, and I think if the chancel was in ruin he probably wouldn't have done that. So it may well have been kept in repair at that stage. and it may be only in a later stage that the chancel went out of use. So what does the church look like in the early modern period? Well, luckily, we already saw Thomas Dineley's drawing of the college, and he's got this wonderful drawing also of St. Mary's Church. So it's worth looking at this in some detail. He's showing us, he obviously knows, we obviously can be assured of where he is, because you've got the Youghal graveyard in the background here. So we know he's been, and in fact, he's toured through Ireland in 1681. He left Ireland through Youghal, so I think he was in Youghal for several days. So we have this church. The chancel is now in ruin, but we see the lancets, and we see this doorway that still exists. We have at least two chantry chapels attached to the church. A chantry chapel basically is a chapel that somebody founds for priests to say mass for their souls in perpetuity. Often they have some sort of a tomb in the church, and there's also an altar, and so these priests are paid to pray for their souls forever. That's what chantry chapels are. The one here was called the Portugal's Chapel, we're told by Dineley, and we're not sure what the name of this one is. Somebody may well know. Again, with the tower, he's exaggerated the tower to some extent. It was never as tall as that. And also, interestingly here, you can see a little bit of red there. Can you see a little bit of red there? What he's showing us that the Boyle tomb in the south transept is visible inside the church. I think that's what he's saying there. The other feature which you may be able to see is, because the chancel is ruined, he's also trying to show us the east gable. So here, basically, this whole bit is in ruin, and there is some sort of a structure across the chancel arch there, and it looks like, for all the world, it looks like a rig of a ship, doesn't it? It's been used almost like a mainsail. It's using that to close off the east end. And he talked about he went into the church, in through the ruined chancel. He saw the Fleming tomb, which is up at the east end, and then he went into the chancel, or into the nave of the church, where he saw this pulpit I talked about earlier on, or this very elaborate rood screen, of which this may be part. And what else do we see? I said that square sail type rigging closed off the choir. Now, so Dineley did a tour of Ireland, starting in Dublin, worked his way down the country. He, in St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, where there's another Boyle tomb, he'd do that as well. Boyle ended up with 5 monuments to himself, which is a lot of monuments. When you think of, was it Charlie Hall? He was born in 3 different places. Well, Boyle had 5 different monuments to himself. And Dineley also do the one in Dublin. But if you look at it here, it is extraordinarily fidelity to the actual monument itself. So you can argue that, what you can use that is to say that, well, Dineley was a very good artist. So what he showed us in terms of what was in the church, exterior of the church, and in terms of interior monuments, he was a very good recorder. And this is, of course, the Bennett tomb, which also was in the south transept, which Boyle had remade when Boyle took over the church in 1603, whenever it was, or bought the south transept. He said that the Bennett and Barry, who were the founders of the church, their tomb had been destroyed or was worn out, so he built them a new one, which was, of course, his own way of linking himself back into a medieval past. That's how that worked. And there are other monuments in the church, and some of them still exist, which Dineley also recorded. This one is over here in the north transept. This one is in the chancel. That one is over there again in the aisle for the north transept. And I think some of these others exist as well. And what you're really seeing here in the 1680s is people are already interested in their history in the past. And there's also an interest in the past before the Commonwealth period, before the Civil Wars, looking back to the late medieval period, and seeing these churches as, great continuity into the contemporary period for people like Dineley. And in fact, in the 1690s in Dublin, not in Dublin, sorry, in Meath, Anthony Dopping, who was the Bishop of Meath, there were things called visitations where you sent out these questionnaires to all the parishes, and they filled in these questions, giving an indication of the state of the parishes within the diocese and the diocese as a whole based on that. One of his questions in the 1690 was to record the monuments in the churches. So this was really important for that period. So now, before I move into the more modern period, let's have a quick look at what's going on elsewhere. So we're now in the 1680s, 1690s, 1700s, so we're going into the early 18th century. Elsewhere, what's going on is, this is a 1630s church built by Boyle, or under Boyle's patronage, in Bandon. And it looks like a medieval church, isn't it? It's called Gothic Survivalism. Same here in the 1660s. This is very dark, I apologise for it. It's Ballinderry Middle Church, which was built by Bishop Jeremy Taylor, the famous Bishop Jeremy Taylor. Again, it's got new features in it, but I'm sure you can't see at all. Some old features like the windows, but it's got box pews and it's got a triple-decker pulpit. About 1700, St Mary's in Dublin, on St Mary's Street. I'm not going to show you the interior of it because it's now a pub, so I'm not going to desecrate the interior of St Mary's by showing you a picture of the interior of a pub. Instead, I'm going to show you St Werburgh's, also in Dublin. But what you have here is you've got a totally different idiom going on. In the medieval period, you had a chancel and nave. Here in the early 18th century, you have what are called auditory churches. So there are much more, there's two things going on. One is that hearing is far more important. In the medieval period, the people in the nave would have said the Pater Noster, the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer, and they would have said the Creed. But for the rest of the time, they were just hearing the priest speaking in Latin. In the 18th century, they're using the prayer book, very important readings, sermonizing an awful lot more. You needed a lot more light for that. You still have you've got a very, very fine chancel in St. Werburgh's, but it's not a big, long chancel like you have in medieval churches. It's more integrated into the building. And what I want you to look at here is the gallery level here and the box pews in the nave here. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. So that's what's going on around us. If we get a bit closer, here we have early 18th century architecture in Cork, St. Peter's, in Peter Street in Cork. This is old St. Nicholas, again in Cork. This is down in way down west. Name escapes me. And here is Castle Martyr Church, 1720s, 1726, and Andrew Chelsea. Again, round-headed windows, a bit like we see in St. Peter's in Cork. And this is the interior of it in the late 19th century. It's got an apse chancel. Can you see that? A narrow, quite shallow chancel, not like the medieval ones which would have continued up there. Does that make sense? Apse chancel. So, what's really interesting about a church like St. Mary's is that what sometimes happens is somebody come along tonight and we'll talk about the medieval and then say, that's great, look at this, it's still medieval. There is a whole period in between before it goes back to being medieval. Or the other word for it is before the Gothic revival started in the 19th century. There's a whole sort of 3 centuries that are sometimes forgotten about. And that's what I try to do to a certain extent in that book I wrote, is to try to bring these periods in the middle back. And what's really interesting about Youghal is that it has very good documentary evidence. We have the registers survive from 1665. The council book of the Corporation of Youghal is really, really interesting. It was published by Richard Caulfield in the 19th century. We have Vestry Minute books, which begin in 1739. And as any of you who ever sat on vestry know that very little religion to do with vestries. It's business. It's business. But you get a huge amount of social history, and often in the cases, a lot of building history as well. So they're really important things. and Youghal is a very fine set of them, going back to 1739. Later rule of visitations, and then there's some 19th century stuff. For example, the Council Book of the Corporation of Youghal, in 1617, so you can imagine Boyle is still involved in Youghal. There's quite a whole section concerning the election of church wardens. Church wardens are busy people now, but they were really, really busy people in the early modern period, and probably the medieval period as well, because they were charged with collecting cess or assessments. So you assess the clergyman got his tithes, but to run the church you assess the local population for income to run the church. And it didn't matter what religion you had to pay your cess to the established church. So these people, they would have done an assessment and said, we need £13, for example, in 1730 to run the church for the year, and they would strike a rate based on everybody living in Youghal and say, 4 halfpenny or whatever it was, and everybody was obliged to pay that. And these church wardens had to go out and collect this. As you know, further on in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century, tithes became a huge issue, and you had tithe proctors and tithe farmers and stuff like that. But anyway, 1617 really concerned with church wardens and their election thereof, and they decided on that the mayor, bailiff, and recorder of the Corporation of Youghal could elect one church warden, and the warden of the college elected the other. So it's a bit like isn't it a bit like the church warden elected by the clergy and by the people? So it's basically the same as that. Okay, in 1620 we know that there was slating and tiling of the church and also the Cortes. So you see how Youghal was working. It's a Protestant town in the 17th century. In the 1670s, so if you imagine the restoration of the church in 1660, in 1670 you'd expect things to be back up and going again, but in 1670, it's in the Corporation Book of Youghal, it says that the mayor and corporation wrote to the Bishop of Cloyne to talk about, or to bring up in front of him, the strange neglect of preaching and reading of divine service in this great congregation of Youghal. So there is this delay in getting the church back going in the post-Commonwealth period. And so that's what you get. But then when you move on to the vestry minute books, you have all these wonderful details here. For example, I'll just pick up two of them in particular. First of all, in 1726, the gallery over the communion table was taken down. You remember now at this stage the chancel is ruined, so the communion table is here somewhere. So it's all in the nave. And the gallery over it is taken down, and a new chancel projecting 10 or 12 feet be made in the form of a semicircle. I was saying to you about an apse chancel. So what happened was there is a chancel put in here, but it's a very short one, and it's an apse one. So the rest of that is left being ruined, but there is a short chancel added. In 1773, we have William Mead, and we also have John Morrison. John Morrison is the father of Richard Morrison and the grandfather of William Vitruvius Morrison. Really, really important architects. There's a lot of country house seats in Ireland, and also churches like Cashel Cathedral. And all these other ones, which you can look at for a second while I move on. Really interesting things here about clergy, select vestries in particular, and church wardens were really, enthused is the wrong word, really concerned with seating. Because quite extraordinarily, seats are private property in churches. You had things called box pews. You had a door in it. You opened the door, you went in and you closed it. And you paid for that. You paid for the privilege of owning it. And of course, there was exchanges, and it was like conveyancing. But it was a way of getting income for the church. So that was one of the functions of the church wardens. So it's not surprising that in 1791, they're renumbering seats and saying, that this person hasn't been in this family's moved out of the parish 20 years ago. We need to take back that seat and sell it on. So you have these. And interesting, look, only one seat was kept for the poor. So the poor will always be with us, but not necessarily in church. We have box pews. And then in 1820, they had an aspirational request of raising £1,500 from the Board of First Fruits. And thankfully they didn't get it, because if they had got it, we'd have ended up with a church like New Ross, with a First Fruits church in the ruin of the medieval church, almost certainly. So sometimes by not getting money, you're being saved a bullet. These are examples of late 18th century rural visitations. I just transcribed them, we won't worry about them because I want to keep going here. So, what did Youghal look like in the 18th century? You know now there are going to be box pews in it. You know there's going to be at least one gallery and probably more galleries. We looked at St. Whereabouts, and there's a wonderful 1833 drawing of the interior of St. Mary's in Youghal in the Dublin Penny Journal. And that's what it looked like. Isn't it extraordinarily different? So everything is in this part of the church. Okay, we have this narrow apse chancel. That's not the east window up there. That window is much closer. It's just at the end of a short apse. It's Gothic form. You can see the limestone slabs of the floor. You've got these box pews. And then, extraordinarily, between each bay of the nave there, you had a big, massive gallery. Okay? Very extraordinary thing. So you can imagine galleries here. I mean, you still find them in some churches, but they would have been quite overpowering. You can see them here. Okay? We have an 18th century pulpit with tester. Not the current one. This was, as I said, was painted by Drew. We have our horseshoe communion rail. This is a heating system, and these are the benches for the poor. So the poor get to sit in the middle of the nave. The other feature is sometimes you see this in churches around the place. You see the Decalogue, you know, the Ten Commandments written at the east end of the church. This would certainly have been a Decalogue, and the other one probably would have been the Lord's Prayer or some other prayers. This window still survives here, but it's slightly different shape. And the other major feature is that I mentioned about the painted panels that might have been on the roof there. They were taken down, sold to, I think it was William Mead actually, and instead he put up a coved ceiling. So what you have is this sort of rounded ceiling. It's a loft and plaster ceiling suspended from above, so this roof would not be visible. In fact, it would have felt a lot lower and a bit claustrophobic. And if we look very quickly at a plan of the church in the 1840s by the Ecclesiastic Commissioners, you see all the box pews. It's absolutely packed. Packed to the gills. If you were sitting in the box pew there, you were going to see nothing or hear nothing. And in fact, the extraordinary thing about box pews is they're seating on three sides. So half the congregation are facing that direction. You know, so you could easily be, the clergyman could be there preaching and you're facing this direction, and you could be doing whatever you like. Not necessarily listening to what was being said. And here is the short apse chancel here. So this is a very good drawing. That combination of pair of drawings is, I think, what I find really exciting about seeing the periods that we don't see in many churches anymore, or the developments over the centuries. I'm not going to talk about this very much, except to say that you can see the windows are very different on the south elevation of the nave. There were dormer windows. It must have been very dark, so they had to put windows in the aisle roofs. This is the exterior, which we're all familiar with today. Up to the 1840s, there was only a narrow passage into the church. And there's a complaint of one of those earlier rural visitations who were saying that the passage from Mouse Street, I think, which is now the one down by the library, into the church is very narrow. And quite extraordinarily, if this building here, which I suspect, this plot of ground which was given by, which was sold or given to the corporation by the Duke of Devonshire in 1848, if there were buildings on that, which I suspect there were, then quite extraordinarily, the Catholic parish church, St. Mary's, would have been far more visible in the 1780s up to the 1840s than St. Mary's was, if it only had this narrow laneway up to it like that, narrow passage up to it. And of course that opened up in the 1848 when the Duke of Devonshire exchanged land or donated land to the church. The other thing I should have said a little bit earlier is that huge congregation in Youghal, they built a chapel of ease down at South Abbey, which is now a school again, isn't it, or whatever it is.
Again.
You know what I mean. How do we get from here to what we have now? Well, you get it by very brave and very persistent clergymen who are also being very, very careful, because one of the great fear in the Irish Church of Ireland, is never to be seen to be too high church or too close to being Catholic. It's like it's verboten. You just can't do it. And the danger in the 19th century, you had two movements. One was the Oxford movement, with people like who's now Cardinal Newman, or John Henry Newman, and the Oxford movement. And you had another movement called the ecclesiological movement, which was, how would you change your churches to look at this new way of looking at sort of the reintroduction of medieval way of looking at things. So you would have had, you had a certain amount of Gothic revival going on by the board of first fruits. You know, it began to look a bit Gothic. And then you had, as the ecclesiastical commissioners came along from the 1833 onwards, began to see more features of Gothic in new churches. But the question is, what do you do with churches that are medieval? And this sort of concerned our friend Pierce Drew, who would have got the ecclesiastical commissioners involved and was probably horrified about what they were going to do to his church. He was very wealthy, so he paid for a lot of the restoration himself. This is Drew here, clergyman, retired in 1871. I think he retired just after disestablishment. And this is another from Youghal, another person from Youghal, Edward Fitzgerald, architect and antiquarian, who was involved in the restoration. And what they did was, well, first of all, Drew basically insured himself by saying things like, if I can find it here, bear with me. He wrote a pamphlet saying Puseyism leads to popery. So he insured himself by sort of saying, if I make changes to this church, I'm against it, if that makes sense. And as opposed to the articles, homilies, liturgy of our church. On the other hand, he wanted to restore the church, but he had sort of given himself that insurance. So what he and Fitzgerald did was, first of all, they persuaded the owners of the galleries that they were no longer really suitable. So they got rid of the galleries. They got rid of the compass ceiling roof. Okay. More radically, they got rid of the galleries. They didn't get very far with the box pews. So they sort of held off on that. You know, there's only so much you can do. But what they did do was reopen the chancel, which is a huge statement in a sense in the 1850s, mid-1850s. You are pushing the boundaries of what you can do in terms of Church of Ireland ecclesiology. Again, there was a certain amount of insurance taken. There is glass in the east window, which was designed by Drew's daughter, in fact, but it is heraldic glass. It doesn't have, later glass has scenes from the older New Testament. Much safer to just have heraldic glass so nobody can complain too much about what you might be saying. So we know that they took down they opened up the chancel, took down the roof, took away the galleries, opened up the church completely like that. So extraordinary changes. They had already closed the doors into the aisles. And that's the way it stood, really. There was a proposal to repew the church by Joseph Welland, who's the architect of the Ecclesiastical Commissioners, who's actually from Middleton now for a little bit. And it would have been absolutely chock-a-block full of very close seating. They held off on that, and they actually didn't repew the church until after disestablishment, 1873, 1874. They collected money locally. And what you have then is in the late, this is a photograph from the 1880s, 1890s, after the repewing here. And the benches you're sitting in, I've seen this around you, they're extraordinarily comfortable and large, aren't they? You've got lots of legroom, lots of space. They're not stuck together. There's a touch of the old size of the box pew still about them, even though that they're now bench seats. So we have our warden's seat with the mitre on it. We have the new pulpit here that was given by Drew. We have the seating. We have the flooring here. The other feature we have here, which is the fact that the walls are rendered, and it looks. I think this is actually the most. This is, I think, my favourite view of the church when these walls are rendered. I presume the render was taken off in the 50s or 60s, was it, or 60s and 70s, yes, when they were doing the they had to redo the wall plates there on the nave roof. So it's quite an extraordinary church. So there's two other, I suppose, I want to finish up by saying two other things.